Welcome back to another episode of Hungry for the Word. Today, we're going to talk a little bit about this happens every time. And I, again, we're listening to some feedback from some viewers and recognizing that the laying out of the agenda in the first half um, sort of softens it instead of jumping right into the immediate content. Although I'll say in my defense, as part of what we're going to talk about today is the Gospel of Mark, and Peter is very much that way. Many of the other uh, Gospels start earlier in Jesus's life. In fact, John going all the way back to the beginning, but Mark, which is the a future disciple of Peter, so Peter sort of dictating it to him at this point. He starts immediately with John's proclamation and then Jesus's baptism and temptation. And so I think we can jump right in. But today I do want to talk about um, this happens every time as sort of the process, I'll say, of the word being sown much more deeply into you and being able to create roots that last, um, and kind of coming on the heels of what I felt was such a great and encouraging word in our last couple episodes. You know, he wants you to flourish. That word was coming to me as we were sharing it through the episodes. And I think sometimes I tend to forget that this process can happen. Um, and so without further ado, the process is this. It's Mark uh, chapter 1, verses 12, or sorry, 11 and 12. And I have it sort of roped off in my Bible as see this so that I don't forget. And then I still tend to forget. But it's, again, Jesus is being baptized. Verse 11, and a voice came from heaven. You are my son, the beloved. With you I am well pleased. But then immediately, and it even says that, and the Spirit immediately drove him out into the wilderness. He was in the wilderness 40 days, tempted by Satan, and he was with the wild beasts, and eventually angels waited on him. And I think why I have that roped off is that's, I think, the process. and and part of what Jesus is describing, as we've talked about in the most important parable, Mark 4, Matt 13, it's somewhere in Luke as well, which is the parable of the sower and how the Father is the sower. And he comes and lays such a beautiful word on you. And to Jesus, again, yes, the Son of God, but at this point in his ministry, the man, Jesus, and he hears this word from heaven. You are my son, the beloved. With you, I am well pleased. And immediately upon hearing this word, he goes into the wilderness. He fasts for 40 days. And I think it's funny, again, how the gospel of Peter, the gospel of Mark, is so nonchalant. All the other ones talk about the temptations that he faced. All the other ones mention God's, or rather Satan's words to him and the layers of things he was tempted with. But the Gospel of Mark skips all that. And I think it's for the purpose of showing that this thing that happened to Jesus for, if you will, the last and final word that needed to happen before his earthly ministry truly began to fruit is this is the process of what happens as a believer. And in fact, I think part of why Peter remembers it in this way is because he, at several times through the earthly ministry, and then even after Jesus was gone, so quickly received a word and was all in and swore by it, and then fell to the opposite end of the extreme, ended up being rebuked or, at the very last one, sought out by Jesus for turning from that. But it's so important to recognize, and it's happened to me, and that there's frustration that comes with it. I think there's, um, a recognition of the wisdom objectively, and the Lord knows what he's doing. He
Hmm.
absolutely knows what he's doing. But when you can't see all that he's doing, or worse, you don't need to see what he's doing, but you're feeling and experiencing it. And I think about how some of the things that I've asked the Lord for, and we've talked about this, but the scene in uh, Evan Almighty, not Bruce Almighty, the subsequent one, where Evan's wife at one point prays that her family could be closer. And when God's talking to her, he says, when people ask for courage, you think he just zaps them with courage, or does he give them opportunities to be courageous? And so I think that's ultimately what's happening here. Is it's very easy from the ego's perspective, from viewing just how you feel during this process, how it affects you, how you are, maybe there's a victim narrative in me that's still, being offended by this, maybe. But a word comes, he wants you to flourish. And then immediately on that being challenged, ego says, look, 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 it's not true with this challenge. And spirit says, here's an opportunity to be courageous. Here's an opportunity to believe that word in light of Satan immediately coming and tempting you. Or as it says in the parable in Mark 4, the birds of the air, they try and take it. The scorching heat tries to take it. And then the cares and concerns of this world try to choke it out. All of that falling upon you after what I would say is such a high of receiving such a loving word, it almost makes it more painful to feel like you see so clearly all the areas of your life where this word isn't true, and to learn that the Lord isn't, again, doing this to drag your face in the mud or to humble you or to do something to you, that this is your opportunity to be like your older brother, to be like the Father, to totally and unreservedly follow him and believe in him. And the potential, I'll say, of dying in that process is part of what gives it the ability to take such deep root in your heart.
Hmm. Well, I'm just reminded, you often relate to Job, who is, the epitome of this process, or really
Mm,
just executes the process. And a lot of people like to talk about it
mm,
as, see, this is, I'm having a Job experience, and this is so hard.
mhm.
But these kind of things come in our life to show us what's in our heart.
Exactly.
And we're learning to love the Lord God wholeheartedly.
Mm,
And these areas of our lives, we're not there yet,
mm,
wholeheartedly there yet.
mm,
So these are up, and that's why we do get encouragement from both John and I think Peter, that count it all joy when this stuff happens, because
yeah.
this is what's happening.
Yeah.
But as you said, when you're in the middle of it, it's very difficult to hear those pat answers
Mm,
and count it joy. But the more we can be aware and understand that this is the process of
mhm.
going through our heart beliefs, current, and how they're out of harmony with the truth of the word that came to you.
Right. Well, and uh, I'll say two thoughts. One, that's a great segue into what I want to talk about next. But, um, without hyper focusing on the specific word choice, which I think is ironically one of the things I'm being shown in myself is my hyper criticality of getting it right. But I think I'm also so tempted to speak over sort of my current situation and say my heart thinks this and there be some truth to it while having to be careful with proclaiming that as true as opposed to, in the quantum world, the part of me that's risen with him. And, I've been living in Romans uh, the last couple of weeks. And I might have mentioned it even on the last episode that Paul is not condemning them as it might seem as you read it, is sort of cursory. He's encouraging them like crazy. He's reminding them for, almost 6 chapters straight in as many different words and analogies and examples as he can give that they have been co-buried and co-raised, and
Mm,
how he, Paul himself, at the time he's writing that letter, says, I'm a wretched man and I can't seem to get anything right. The only time I get it right is when I set my mind on the spirit and not on the flesh, is when I remember and am not offended. Like, we might have mentioned it before, but Chris Blackaby, the way he talks about this process is that if you went to a doctor and you had broken a bone, but the bone healed incorrectly, that a good doctor re-breaks that bone so that it can set properly. And
mm,
you can have the emotions that you want. And let me tell you, the ego will make a case. I have stacks of pages this big that I've written on of why the case against that being the way a good doctor would do it. And I think in part there's this, um, maybe call it millennial, but I'll just say in the world that we live in today, microwave, knowing that on some level the Lord could snap his fingers and it's done, that, so many of the Proverbs talk about wisdom being greater than gold and silver and fine jewels, and how wealth gained quickly is also lost quickly. And so when you think of wisdom as wealth, to recognize that these things happening are building a wealth of wisdom and life experience in me that might come a little slower, but last a lot longer.
mm.
And like we've said, you can objectively say that, but the segue, if you will, is I've also been reading the Carol Dweck's book. It's called Mindset: The New Psychology of Success, and it's not a promotion, but we'll link that in the bio. I would recommend it to people. Um, the recognition of how many areas, I'll say, of my mindset, to use her words, but as you're talking about heart beliefs, that these are fixed beliefs in me as opposed to growth, and how much that has significantly hindered, limited the depth of my experience of some of those promises because of how fixed I am in some of those areas. And so when we're talking about, the process, this is the way that it happens, because I had, a mixed bag of, I'll say have a mixed bag of fixed and growth mindset when it comes to challenges. The Lord showed me the other day that pain and anger, as you walk through an experience, are a hot coal. And so, me having every right to be mad and be angry and be in unforgiveness only resulted in me holding that hot coal as I walk through the experience. And it gets, I'll say, increasingly easier as you walk through a specific experience to set down that hot coal. Um, but to just see that, carrying the fixed mindset about the way the Lord is stretching me and having you grow, having you become the person that you said, hey, I want to be courageous and not afraid of death. And in fact, I said, Father, I want to be like you, period. I admire you so much. I want to be like you. And so the second verse that I have is from Proverbs 30:20. And I had sent it to you the other day. Um, just I'll say again as a recognition that the process you're going through, and the Lord knows this, that it isn't necessarily easy. And it, actually, it looks like I 2030, not 30:20. There it is. Um, he says, blows that wound cleanse away evil, and beatings make clean the innermost part. And like I said, the ego is so quick to weaponize that against God, to create separation, to make me angry at him, to see it as my sort of separate self. This beating is happening to me. And ego interprets that as alienation, fear, pain, separation, uh,
Rejection.
indication. Yes, rejection, 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 indication of my iniquity. And Spirit has been encouraging me. And at times you accept that encouragement, and at times you feel too frustrated to accept the encouragement, that this walking closer to death, just to use that analogy, is how you become not afraid of it, I think, and how you can enjoy a resurrection like Christ's, knowing that he took the sting of death so that you don't have to go to the cross to experience life, that you can come. And again, I'm so hesitant to use these words because I know how much they've been put into a martyr mindset, but pick up your cross and suffer like him, not because it's um, what's the word I'm looking for? Um, self sacrifice. It's not in that way, that you're being noble and Christ's death wasn't enough, so you must also die, but participation in the Mark 1 process. Your dying is get a word and then go be tempted by the Spirit. And again, you don't have to seek it out. I think that's the difference. You know, um, he'll take you through it. Self-sacrifice, we kind of seek out, where can I give myself? And there's truth in that too. I'm not trying to take a stance. I'm saying for this specific lesson, it feels like it's the opposite of performance, because with performance comes evaluation, either pride or condemnation. And this is not about an outcome and failing or succeeding at that outcome. It's about becoming. And the becoming part isn't always easy. Teething is an uncomfortable process, no matter what you do.
Yeah.
Just is. Yeah.
Well, I think we could, as a body, can learn from number one, this process, and number two, learn how to walk with people through it, right? I
Mm,
mean, just me as a Christian sometimes want to, oh, well, the Bible says, trust
yeah.
in the Lord with all your heart,
Yeah.
and
You
that
want to
it's
you want to
true.
lay truth on it, and that's
It
beautiful.
it is, and that's
Yeah.
actually part of the process. We
Hmm.
do overlay the truth on these beliefs, but I think a better understanding of honestly the death, burial, and resurrection, and actually teaching people to go through that for themselves, whether a meditative process or just instead of fixing up the old man, let the new man be resurrected. And
Hmm.
that's what he's working on when he gives a word, I want you to thrive. He's actually inviting you to walk in a thriving, or your example, the courage. He's inviting you to walk with courage, and you're going to learn how to do that. And we don't have the experience from before. So that's where the death, burial, and resurrection into that new truth, that process of breaking the old bones, and like
Hmm.
we've talked about. But I think as a body, we could get better at just helping people walk through that so it doesn't, you know, so
Yeah,
they
like
don't suffer
Job
during it.
Job
Yeah.
specifically said to his friends, "Could you guys shut up?
Yeah.
Like, I would really
I mean,
just
we're like,
rather sit here in silence than have you tell me all the things that could be and fix it." And
yeah.
so, yeah, there's truth in laying the truth over. And I think you're right. The more in-depth, intimate knowledge of the death, burial, and resurrection, which you can only get by going through it. And I think that
Mhm.
is, um, at times evidence of one perhaps not having gone through it in their own heart is not recognizing the pain that someone else is truly going through
Mhm.
and thinking that let me just throw what should be true at you is going to heal it. Because
Yeah.
I think there's also, a recognition that different people can fill different voids in our lives. And maybe I need to hear that from someone else or this other person or a third person. And so I think there is learning and growth in, each individual relationship that you have. Because with a wife, and I'd be interested to ask Brother Jake about this with his wife, the there are times where someone is so close to you that it's almost like you don't want them involved in it. There's too much coming into this situation. And yet I'm only saying that as an example because where Paul says, bear one another's burdens. I'd like to see where that is if you don't mind looking that up.
Yeah.
Um, but he says bear one another in love. And I think there's a way to do that that you learn from a book. How do I bear one another in love? And then there's going through really hard times yourself and seeing that when you were in the midst of that, you just wanted love and someone holding that space. And eventually you'll find opportunities. And Jake is really good at this, to shout him out again, praying for opportunities to plant a seed, but completely detaching from him being the one who has to plant it. And,
Mhm.
we've all admired that in him. And I'm only saying all this as an aside from, I think that as a body, to know this is what happens, to not
Hmm.
be offended by it, to not talk about it, to not
Yeah.
be open. And again, I think in a lot of ways, we're so ready to point out that we're suffering for Christ. But how much more difficult has it been for me in this past week to talk in such a vulnerable way as I normally do with you about all of my weaknesses being exposed, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm much less likely to do that than say, hey, here's this thing that he's loving on me about, you know?
Yeah.
So as I've gone through um, some of this, how does Proverbs say it again? The blows that wound cleanse away evil. I was thinking of it like a rug, and you throw a rug over a clothesline and you hit it with one of those paddles and you just watch pounds of dust fall off it. And to personify the rug a little bit, you probably wouldn't sit there and say that feels so good. You getting
Yeah.
thwacked 30 times. And yet at the end of the process, you look down and all this dust is coating the ground and you say, that was in me. And count it all joy that I forget who it is. It's probably several of the writers of the New Testament that say, um, and suffering produces character, and character produces endurance. Endurance produces hope, and hope produces the kingdom. And how, Jesus's ability on the cross in that final moment to be tempted, where, the evil man next to him, if you will, and those two being representatives of these little angel and demon you have on your shoulder talking to you, that the one says, come on, son of God, snap your fingers and get us off this. And Jesus knows in his heart that he's not rejected. He doesn't feel in that moment that he's going to be cast aside. He might be experiencing tremendous pain. In fact, was, I don't even need to say might, and yet didn't didn't doubt for a moment that to fulfill the will of his father was more important than him as a man surviving this incident, and to recognize that that internal thing with us, that God's will is the kingdom here on earth, and that Christ took the sting once and for all at the cross so that I could feel only a fraction of the sting as I go through the same resurrection, so that the whole body of Christ stands resurrected on the earth. And that's not easy to talk about. And in fact, I think, especially as men, I don't mean to say it like this, but we really get secluded when it comes to battling some of our deepest demons. And while I'll say theoretically that's the time when we most need support, I think um, not experiencing support in a way that we even know how to ask for leads us to go be alone and suffer in these. Um, and so it's been really helpful, life changing to be able to have one or two or three and have that list grow of people who I can talk to in these moments, and who don't say, well, have you tried this? And have you done that? And are you remembering this? They're saying, man, that sucks. Um, and then again, I think kind of a guy thing, a sarcastic joke about how tough it is to go through, that sort of lightens the mood. Call it gallows humor, you know?
Mm.
Um, and that's an example of what one friend was able to do for me earlier this week, as we ended up FaceTiming for almost an hour and a half, and talked about problems for the first 15, 20 minutes, and then just ended up talking about life. And it's like that. um, NASA experimented with having some of their astronauts wear a really taut rubber band on their wrist, and when they felt themselves fading, if you will, from pain or gravity sickness or whatever, the snapping of that literally causes your brain to fixate on something else, even if just for a moment. And it's pain, it's a knee jerk reaction. But in doing so, you're airlifted out of this rut that you keep traveling in circles and circles and circles and struggling with. You're lifted out so that you can see, oh, there is land outside of that place. But I continue to digress, knowing that we're um, coming up on time. What's sort of bubbling up for you about this is how it happens?
Well, just wanted to mention, I found those scriptures. It's Galatians 6:2 that says, bear one another's burdens and thereby fulfill the law of Christ.
Mm. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And it's Romans 5:3-5, that as patience produces character and character produces hope. So,
Mm-hmm.
and this hope will never disappoint. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. In fact, I was looking for it before we got on here, but turns out it's just from The Chosen. But when Jesus and Nicodemus have a conversation, and Nicodemus is pointing out, give up my title, my life, my wife, my comfort. And Jesus says, you're right. There is a lot you would give up, but what you would gain is greater and far more lasting. And I think maybe somewhere in Corinthians, Second Corinthians, Paul says something to that effect as well. But that's explicitly what Jesus said to Mary and Martha. She's chosen the greater thing and it won't be taken away from her. And to recognize how much the I'll say the former part of me wants to choose. I'd rather have money. I'd rather have riches than this stupid life wisdom. And yet to again recognize in a deeper place in me that wisdom will never be taken away, even though money comes and goes. And the depth of intimacy with the Father is the eternal gift that can't be taken away from you, and how much more valuable that is than temporary validation, you know?
yeah, that just reminds me of another one of Paul. This light affliction that I've uh, gone through. And
Mm-hmm.
if you look at Paul's life, it's really not light
Yeah, he
infliction
was
that he's.
stoned to death in that specific instant. The light affliction of his spirit man having to pick up his physical body and drag it back to Jerusalem so that he could put himself back in it and come back to life. Minor, slight inconvenience.
Yeah.
Mm,
So we're joking about it, and we have, we started. When you started, and you said you prayed for, if you pray for courage, God's not going to just zap you with it. But used to be a joke. Never pray for courage, never pray for patience. That's
mm-hmm,
just inviting this stuff into your life. And
mm-hmm.
it's true. It will be
Consider the
challenged.
cost.
Consider the cost, right?
Mm-hmm,
It will be challenged. But for me and my walk, I'm happy to have seen like that rug that you talked about and all the dust that was in it. I'm happy to have seen what was, had opportunities to really see what was in my heart
mm,
and the beliefs that I did have that were incongruent and
right.
basically limiting God
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
and
what he
in
could do in my life.
retrospect, yeah. And again, that I recognize that objectively also in retrospect, how much
Mm-hmm,
more thankful I'll be to not have this anymore, to spend the money up front, as it were,
mm-hmm.
instead of kicking the can down the line and just trying to drive a car that has problem after problem, that he's an expert mechanic. So we are almost at time. What's bubbling up for you?
Well, that I just summarized. Yeah, that's
Nice.
good.
Perfect. Yeah, I think to know and encourage each other that we shouldn't be offended as we're driven into the wilderness. and extremely frustrated. And that, to your point, it helps a lot when the support system around you isn't like Job's friends and just keeps telling you everything you're probably doing wrong that caused that. But to know for yourself, if you don't yet have anyone who can minister the way we're fortunate to have people, to each other and minister to others and others minister to us, that you're you might be having a quote Job moment, a wilderness moment, but it's not because of anything you did. In fact, if it's because you did anything, it's that you had a heart that wanted to be more like him. So he's taken you through the journey because of how much he loves you to get rid of all that's preventing you from being like him: pain, death, anger, you name it, fixed mindset, et cetera, et cetera. And that each child he'll take the way they're supposed to go. And so you can trust the way he's taken you.
Yeah, I also encourage you kind of mentioned it, but David encouraged himself in the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And while others, it's great to have a support system, like you also mentioned before, sometimes we don't even know what to ask for, and the people around us can't give us that.
Mm-hmm.
So I encourage everyone to really learn how to minister and encourage yourself in the Lord.
Mm,
Um,
agreed.
and have different tools in your toolbox, if you will, to be reminded, help remind your own heart and persuade your own heart as it transforms from letting go of these old beliefs and
Agreed.
embracing the truth.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Blessings.
Blessings. Bye.